Chair. First of all, thank you everyone for participating in this and permitting us to participate in this wonderful day. I'd like to compliment our Chairman Marcello Suarez Oresco for his energy and enthusiasm, and Ram, if he's here, for all of his work on this project. As many of you have been saying throughout this summit, my husband and I firmly believe that our work toward a climate and resilient future is not possible without two things. One is the recognition that climate change is inextricably linked to inequality, and that the solutions are only going to arrive out of a complex interaction of expertise, people, and field in order to make the progress that we need. Our foundation is committed to building a more knowledgeable and inclusive society, as the mayor said, with a special emphasis on environmental sustainability and income inequality. So we're going to split our comments today and start with Jim, who's going to discuss the connections and interactions between climate change and wealth inequality. Something when we started the foundation, we didn't appreciate how important that interaction is.
Thank you. It's no surprise that most of the talks today about the harms of potential harms and actual harms of climate change are focused on direct physical threats, drought, flooding, human and animal habitat disruption, and the like. But I want to use my time today to talk about a less discussed subject, and that's the vicious cycle that arises between climate change and wealth inequality. As context, let me explain that Cathy and I agreed some years ago, we've been lucky financially and we can do some philanthropic work, that for maximum impact, our philanthropy should be tightly targeted, more like a laser than a flood lamp. So we each picked a single issue around which to center the bulk of our giving. Cathy's was sustainability and biodiversity. Mine was unequal wealth concentration. I spoke at this forum 2 years ago about that, about the harms, moral, economic, and political, that arise from excessive wealth inequality and the accelerating trend in that direction around the world today. And I'm not going to try to recount any of that. Let me only say that extreme wealth concentration runs roughshod over all of our better instincts for justice, compassion, and decency. It can render a democracy an empty fiction. It can stultify economies. I'm not going to, as I said, make those arguments again, but I will use my few minutes to argue the case that climate change is amplifying the already ugly trend towards wealth sequestration at the top, and further, that exaggerated concentration of wealth in turn hampers our ability to restrain climate change. The first of these twin assumptions is straightforward. The injuries of climate change fall unequally among economic strata within societies and among nations. It should be apparent that arid soil, intensifying winds, unhealthy extremes of heat, contraction of grazing lands, invasive diseases are affecting tropical nations more than those of us in temperate zones. Countries in the global south, already poorer than those in the north, have contributed the least to the problems of climate change and are suffering the most. And they're the least equipped to pay for the required preparation and adaptation. So even with today's expanded consciousness on the issue, the global most privileged 1% are still responsible for more emissions than the entire bottom half of the world's population. Justice surely requires that wealthier nations that have brought us to this point aid those poorer nations to adapt without asking them to sacrifice their own paths to economic betterment. Within national boundaries, the greatest pain of climate change also falls on those least able to bear it. Scholarship suggests that harmful emission-related inequalities within nations are just as great as those between nations. Poor neighborhoods easily become unprotected neighborhoods. The wealthy have vastly disproportionate access to air conditioning relief when temperatures are unhealthy, to foods that become scarce or expensive, to second homes, to employment in comfortable offices. We have to take great care not to impose solutions for the warming trends that tilt the costs even more towards the least financially secure. I'm happy to see that solutions such as carbon taxes, which are quite attractive and promising in many respects, are now being subject to examination for their distributed economic effects as well. Adaptive responses may need to be coupled with redistributive policies if they're to pass economic and ethical muster. Looking at this in the reverse direction, the reasons that wealth inequalities accelerate climate change are only slightly more subtle. As wealth becomes more concentrated, the most fortunate few can insulate themselves from the adverse effects of climate, and as a result, their empathy for others may diminish. Lack of common experience tends to reduce willingness to endure even modest sacrifices. Climate isolationism, unfortunately, appears to be on the rise now. Inequalities of means also shift political power to elites, to oligarchs, to neo-aristocrats, and the loss by degree of pluralistic influence over societal policies is a near certain negative for climate justice. Unfortunately, we're witnessing a worldwide acceleration in the flow of wealth to the top, accompanied by a decline in the willingness to accept progressive taxes for financing common goals, and a near complete rejection of what I think is the fairest tax, the estate tax, in virtually all of the leading economies. These trends can only diminish the cooperative efforts that have been talked about today and are necessary to secure resiliency. None of the central issues raised at this conference are easy to solve, and that brings me back to Cathy's and my approach in philanthropy. Wise and practical answers to the hardest questions surrounding environment and optimal wealth distribution remain elusive. While philanthropists cannot afford to pay for the physical protections that have been talked about and that our planet needs, we can help finance the academic work that's required to show us the best approaches. So Cathy and I have aimed our giving at universities, only universities, where the world's top scholars are seeking paths to a healthier climate and sounder distributional economics. In addition to the projects that Cathy has addressed, and that she'll talk a little more about, we've created 11 university centers dedicated specifically to the study of wealth concentration, 6 within the United States and 5 in other countries, and there'll be more. We've charged these centers with training a generation of scholars to tackle the essential questions around merging prosperity, resiliency, and distributive justice. Few accomplishments would make us happier than to feel that our sponsorship encouraged the development of a roadmap for breaking this vicious cycle afflicting climate and wealth concentration. With that, I'll stop and pass the microphone back to Cathy.
Okay. Now the question is, what can philanthropy do in terms of climate change and solving the problems we've so eloquently addressed today? There are many things that philanthropy can do, but I'm going to mention just 3. The first is that we can encourage risk-taking. In Boston, for example, we're looking at the role that augmenting barrier islands could bring, creating new islands, establishing sponge cities, as we've heard earlier, creating eco-reefs, and developing green seawalls. All of these things may fail in the North Atlantic, which is a much more hostile environment than many of these solutions have been developed in more tropical climes. The proof of concept is not there, but philanthropy can take the risk to see if they're going to work before you bring it over to government, which needs some support before they use the public purse. So that's important. Secondly, of course, we can provide some money for experiments such as our friend Tracy Palangin just described, where the way that Michelle Wu, our wonderful mayor, has reached out to the philanthropic community to expand cultural access in Boston, a program that is beyond today's discussion. So philanthropy can provide money. That's a surprise. Um, and lastly, philanthropy can incentivize partnership. We're very keen to do so and can make it part of the condition of the grant that we bring in disciplines. I was so impressed the way Fiona's project brings in architecture, art, social science, ecology, and law, legal systems, and how you protect the poor. Those are the threads of solution. And philanthropy can make it a big portion of their push um, if they recognize the underlying necessity. I might give you a couple of local examples about what we are about. And one is the Living Lab, which is organized through the University of Massachusetts at Boston under Marcello's leadership. And the scientists there, including Paul Kirshen, who's been here today, we are established to test and bring to scale nature-based approaches to coastal resiliency in and around the Boston Harbor, while engaging in place-based climate education and community-focused research in collaboration with local municipalities and NGOs. As of today, the lab has several projects, but I'd like to mention quickly just 3 of them, if I may. One involves the city of Boston, which is incredibly important. The lab monitors wave energy and storm information in the harbor. And at the request of the mayor, we focused in on some of the poorer communities of Boston. And in doing so, for example, there was a storm recently where we had the 4th most powerful storm and more flooding, and discovered where the flooding went and how it affected poor communities. This information was passed over to her team, which involved in creating models for corrections of these problems over the next 20 years. And so we've done that. There's a project dealing with living seawalls developed in Australia, where in southern oceans, the artificially created and designed attachments provide an ecosystem for flora and fauna in the ocean. And the question is, will they work in the North Atlantic? So we've installed 200 panels around the city of Boston, and we're going to monitor it for 3 years and give a report back. And this is our biodiversity project. And the last is a project that deals with whether cobble berms, which are artificially replaced stones and rock, actually, will be a useful resistant to storms and flooding in 6 communities around the Boston Harbor. And so these are small projects, but they are going to generate great information. And if they can be used in other coastal communities. And on that score, ahead of time, I'm going to bring it to a close. It's just that we need philanthropy to bring people together in a way and convene people to have a greater impact than any of our single dollars ever could have. Thank you very much.